Thank you. I was very excited when Carol Ferguson said that she would come to talk to us today in honor of World Polio Day. It was October 24th, and it's always every year on October 24th because we celebrate the birthday of Dr. Jonas Salk, who was the initiator of the first vaccine. So I didn't realize that we were going to get 3 polio survivors. We have 3 polio survivors. Carol brought 2 of her friends with them. Carol is a very modest lady. She gave me a very short bio. She tells me that she grew up in Glenside, and I know that she is the founder of the Pennsylvania Polio Survivors Network. That's why she's here. And I, without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Carol, and she will fill us in on the latest news about polio.
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you. I have my phone.
Sure.
Oh, you're a dog. Thank you. If I tell you I'm not humbled to be here, I'd be lying. And if I tell you that having May and Win here today isn't emotional for me, I'd be lying. In Rotarians, we believe in service and honesty and integrity. I'm the Polio Plus coordinator for District 7430 right next door, and I'm glad that we do a lot pre-COVID, a lot of projects together. A little bit about where I come from. On March 6th, I got my second COVID vaccine and I burst into tears. And the young man that gave it to me, he said, "Did I hurt you?" And I said, "No, absolutely not. I'm overwhelmed with gratitude. I got the polio vaccine 1 year too late." Polio is a deadly and permanently disabling virus that has no cure. We're going to talk about the truth behind this terrible disease and the power of vaccines. And hopefully when I'm done, you're going to have a lot of questions, which we're going to be happy to try and answer. In 2014, our team began our journey bringing forth information managing the lifelong disabling effects of this terrible disease. We're an all-volunteer team of 9, 4 of whom are polio survivors. Our mission is very simple. We use the values of the 4-way test to help us serve all polio survivors and their caregivers. We provide information from credible sources so that survivors can once again help themselves. We share a passionate connection with Rotary International and their partners to stop polio in its tracks. Because of this enormous effort, polio will soon be the second disease in history, smallpox being the first, to be eradicated by the effective use of vaccines. This is the basis for our dedication to Polio Plus. Rotary and their partners in the Global Polio Eradication Initiative, or called GPEI, are tireless in their efforts to focus on disease prevention by vaccinating every child that can be. The infrastructure that's being created as a result is unmatched in public health. We asked survivors to join us in celebrating our gratitude for Rotary International's determined effort to eradicate this terrible disease. The response that we expected from Pennsylvania and New Jersey was global. These words are meant for all Rotarians. These words are meant for you. These moving words came from more polio survivors than we can even begin to count. Rotary's effort in the area of disease prevention is much bigger than just polio. This might sound odd coming from us, but as a result of what we've learned, we've discovered that we're much bigger than polio too. Yes, we're experiencing the lifelong effects of the polio virus, but of greatest importance, we are Wynn, May, and I are survivors of what is now a vaccine-preventable disease. So just what exactly is this disease that Rotarians hear so much about? You're capable of reading this clear CDC definition yourselves. We have another adjective to describe it. Polio stinks. It's a lousy, lousy disease. You may have heard the term round and round and round she goes, where she stops, nobody knows. That's true for all of us that have polio. Somehow, and most of us will never know, we ingested it. It traveled into our bellies and up into our spinal cord. Just how far it went and the damage that it did can be vastly different. This is what most of us here in the U.S. think polio looks like. Here's another polio truth. This is what polio looks like today. And polio also looks like this. The last outbreak of the wild polio virus in the United States was 1979. That means not all of the more than 500,000 plus survivors in the U.S. are on Medicare. In addition, legal immigration, adoption, and very rare occurrences of vaccine-derived polio has resulted in there being very young polio survivors right here in the United States, right here in Pennsylvania. What makes matters worse is that as a result of the long-haul effects of this terrible disease, polio attacks us not once, but twice. That's why polio stinks. These long-haul effects, called post-polio syndrome, or PPS, happens to the vast majority of survivors, regardless of whether or not we had paralytic or non-paralytic polio. As you read the description of these symptoms, you're thinking, that happens to lots of people with lots of things. You're absolutely right. That's why post-polio syndrome is always a diagnosis of exclusion and can be very difficult for physicians to diagnose. We're all the same in survival, yet we're all very different. The 4 active survivors on our team are the clearest example of this. Joe was partially paralyzed from the waist down at age 5. He spent 2 years, yes, 2 years in the hospital. He always had a walking limitation that required crutches and bracing. Joe married, had a long career in the printing business, and now, with post-polio syndrome, he was forced to retire early, is completely dependent upon double braces and crutches. He struggles to manage chronic shoulder pain and is forced to spend more and more time in a power chair. I'm honest about this one, it's hard for me. Deb was completely paralyzed on her right side at age 5. Her parents took her to the local hospital and were told the hospital's full. You've got to take her to the city. Her parents drove 100 miles with their paralyzed 5-year-old, where they dropped her off in quarantine. For the first 2 months, they drove 100 miles every Saturday, went to the parking lot, where their paralyzed little girl waved to them from the window with the only arm she had. They turned around and went home. The hospital was full. Deb is still completely paralyzed on her upper right side. She married, raised 4 children, worked outside the home, and supported her husband in a home-based business. Now, with post-polio syndrome, she's developed lower right side weakness, struggles to manage chronic pain, requires the use of a brace, a cane, and a power chair for any distance walking. And Deb Stombaugh can be seen talking to Rotary clubs all over central Pennsylvania. This one's especially difficult for me with May and Wynn here. I want you to imagine your 2-year-old, your baby, waking up totally paralyzed from the neck down. That's what happened to Jim's mom and dad. They took him to the hospital. They were told the hospital was full. Take him home. Huh? This wasn't in rural Pennsylvania. This wasn't in the rural United States. This was in the city of Philadelphia in 1950. His parents took him home. They did the best they could. His little brother was quarantined on the second floor. His father made a gurney, and they lowered him into a tub where his mother did the only thing she knew to do, which used common sense, turned out to be the Sister Kenny method, where she bathed him multiple times a day in warm water. They hung a quarantine sign on the door, and the family, the whole neighborhood knew that polio was in the house. Jim always had a walking limitation. He married, had a wonderful career, and spent 50 years volunteering for his local fire department. He was forced to retire early, and now with post-polio syndrome, Jim is completely wheelchair dependent. I had what was called the summer grip, or the flu, when I was 2. I only had flu-like symptoms, and I was never hospitalized. My parents never even called a doctor. I recovered on my own in a couple of days with only a slight visible drop foot. I was never even diagnosed as having had polio. But my gradual muscle weakness and significant reactions to anesthesia were evident as a young adult as I started stumbling and falling on a regular basis. After a very long journey, a neurological specialist found the damage that was proof of an old polio. The late effects of this disease have put me in a leg brace. I require a cane for stability. I struggle to manage chronic pain, and I am dependent on a wheelchair for any distance walking. We understand that just like those who suffer today from having to hide their true selves, polio survivors were taught not to speak of it. It was over, it was done. All of this happened because the miracle of the Salk vaccine came too late for us. We often feel very much isolated and alone. We encourage polio survivors and our caregivers to understand the complex issue of both the physical and the psychological symptoms of post-polio syndrome, so that they can become independent once more. Polio survivors can look like this, sad and alone on the left side of the screen, or with proper care and assistive devices, we can look like those on the right side. Some of you recognize that amazing gentleman in the End Polio Now shirt. If we showed you an x-ray of John's spine, you would wonder how he even gets out of bed in the morning. John has had outstanding rehabilitative care and continually learns about post-polio syndrome. That's John throwing out the first pitch at a Rotary night at the Philly Stadium from his power chair. We love helping survivors discover they can go from the left to the right side of the screen. This leads us to our next critical polio truth. We can't forget the survivors. Once zero happens, and there's not a doubt in our mind that zero will happen, because of post-polio syndrome, it will take a full generation for the disabling effects of the polio virus to be completely gone. These photos explain why. As young teenagers, these boys are forced to crawl on the ground. We'll never know the truth, but statistically they had polio much younger. Post-polio syndrome for these two men will be physically devastating. This photo breaks our hearts. Notice the boys on the left who are teasing and making fun of him. He is lonely, afraid, and isolated, all because of the effects of a vaccine-preventable disease. Post-polio syndrome will be a heartbreaking reminder of these painful memories. So let's talk a little bit about the vaccines. The IPV, the inactivated polio vaccine, is often known as the Salk vaccine. It is the only vaccine for polio to be given in the United States since 2000. The OPV, the oral polio vaccine, is often known as the Sabin vaccine. It is the most effective means of delivering it in underdeveloped countries because those precious life-saving drops can be delivered to hard-to-reach areas and can be given by non-healthcare professionals. So Wild polio was eradicated in the United States in 1979. Why are we still having to vaccinate our children and our grandchildren? This is why. Here is the reality we face in our global world. These diseases and more are only a plane ride away. Wild polio has not been eradicated. Due to the extraordinary efforts of Rotary and their partners, only type 1 wild polio virus remains. That means we can't stop now. COVID-19 has created challenges all over the U.S. and abroad, but even so, the work didn't stop. Thanks to the Plus and Polio Plus and the infrastructure that is now in place, there was only a temporary pause in the polio eradication campaigns that are critical in Afghanistan and Pakistan. With masks on their faces and sanitizer in their pockets, immunization teams made their way through towns, knocking on one door after another. When there is a child to be vaccinated, they all stand at a safe distance from each other. They remain compliant with COVID-19 safety measures to make sure the dual message of both the necessary fight against polio and COVID-19 reaches home. Vaccinators say that since the resumption of the immunization campaigns in Pakistan, parents have been more enthusiastic to ensure their children are in fact vaccinated for childhood diseases. Even with the current horrible conflict in Afghanistan, Rotarians, all of us, can answer this call. We strongly believe that the delivery of health care, including polio vaccination, is essential to prevent disease. Together with our partners, the people of Afghanistan and national authorities, we will do everything in our power to continue this critical work. The entire world celebrated just 1 year ago when the continent of Africa was certified as being free of the wild polio virus. Even as we face the realities of another devastating virus, with only type 1 remaining, we are seeing something that is truly positive in a world of fear and uncertainty. We still have work that must be done. We can easily connect the fear of contracting polio to the fear we've been experiencing with COVID-19. The worries that we have for our family and friends are fears that we all share every day as we wait and pray for the vast majority of us to in fact be vaccinated. The memories that are re-emerging of this fear and isolation is troubling at best to the permanently disabled polio survivors all over the United States and abroad. Our compassion for those who are experiencing the long-term effects of COVID-19 is real, and that compassion comes from our hearts. We are all looking forward to this crisis lifting. Even in this grip of this terrible new virus, we are engaged in our commitment to encourage parents to vaccinate their children for the many childhood diseases that are once again threatening to return right here to the United States. Vaccination for smallpox is no longer necessary. It was eradicated in 1980. Thanks to the passion and the raw determination of Rotarians and their partners, polio is very close to being the second disease in history to have that marvelous distinction. Even with COVID-19, the message has remained very clear. Our message is about the truth.
We are survivors who want to help parents understand the pain and disability can, without question, last a lifetime.
As Rotarians, working diligently since 1985 to eradicate polio, we have seen firsthand the beauty of vaccines. In the first 10 months of this year, there have been only 2 reported cases. First 11 months of this year, There have been only 2 reported cases of the wild polio virus in the world, one in Afghanistan and one in Pakistan. Thanks to an emergency authorization by the World Health Organization, the new oral polio vaccine, OPV2, is being widely circulated even with COVID-19 restrictions. We can answer this call. To quote Michael McGovern, "We have never been closer to eradicating polio in Afghanistan. We will continue to work with the Afghani people and our partners to finish what we began over 35 years ago." By working together, we are becoming a part of the solution as we celebrate science. Vaccines work. The thank you for your clubs and Rotarians to support this effort isn't coming from me, isn't coming from our network. It's coming from polio survivors, estimated to be 15 to 20 million of us throughout the world. Our gratitude for Rotary not quitting and staying with us is personal for us, and it's overwhelming. Thank you for heeding this call. Join us.
Saw outbreaks were taking place. Did they realize that there were 2 components? There was the onset issues, and then later in life there would be more? Or was that unknown? And could that have some clues in terms of COVID?
There's a lot of questions there. You've brought up one of my favorite pieces of history. The March of Dimes, the Salk vaccine was developed privately. It was all through donations, the March of Dimes. It was not federally funded. And all the research went the money went to pay for hospitalization for children. 2 of the survivors in that presentation paid for their hospitalization. But unfortunately, none of the funds were put to study survivors. There was no knowledge of post-polio syndrome or no acknowledgement of post-polio syndrome until 1985. That's a big deal. Now, when we talk about the long haul effects of COVID, if I tell you that my rehabilitative physician isn't thrilled with finally the medical community acknowledging that there are long haul effects to these viruses, I'd be lying. He's upset that it's taken this long for polio survivors to be recognized. We struggle getting care right here in the U.S., which is why we worry about the children overseas terribly. Rotarian survivors are very worried about this. But the modern medicine is magnificent, and they are now recognizing very quickly the long haul effects of COVID and the long haul effects of HIV, and that's good stuff. No one will ever tell a polio survivor that there are not long haul effects to a virus, even when we're told there are none. Did I answer that okay? Yes?
How many years did you live with the effects of polio? And do you believe that's the norm? That most people are walking around with the polio long haul and not been diagnosed?
Statistically, it happens, the effects start to come in 15 to 20 years. But it's different for us all, and that's part of what we're learning in our work. My guess is those poor children that are crawling on the ground are going to see the effects much sooner. Statistically in the U.S., it's 15 to 20 years. In my case, it was always there. I always had in the slide with my picture with my dad, I put that slide in there because you could see my knees lower and my ankles turned out. But so it was there. I was stumbling and falling. But post-polio syndrome didn't come my way as an issue until I was 35 and I had minor surgery after I tripped and fell. And when I was on the table in pre-op, they gave me some meds, and my left leg started flipping on the table, you know, like a fish on a dock. And I'll never forget it. The anesthesiologist looked at me and he said, "Does that happen often?" And I said, "Yeah, no big deal." And they're looking at me like, I woke up in intensive care and was there for 3 days. And a year later, I needed another surgery. And God came into my life. I'm convinced that a year later, when the anesthesiologist called me and he said, "We need to figure out what happened to you a year ago." And I said, "Oh, why? No big deal, I'm fine." Because polio survivors are like that, by the way. Consciously or subconsciously, we're working through it, and that's no big deal. And he said, "No, you're not listening to me. I'm going to cancel the surgery if we can't figure it out." And I said, "Well, they said when I was 12, my drop foot was big. I might have had polio as a little kid, but it was never mentioned again." He said, "That's it." I had one of the rare physicians in 1986 that knew about post-polio syndrome. And that began my journey of diagnosis. But my story is different from every other survivor.
So is there a test for that?
Post-polio syndrome, there is no test for.
I mean, the polio, you can
Yes.
find out if you have.
Yes. You're asking great questions.
Oh,
Thank
I'm
you for
sorry.
that. So many people don't know this. It's very difficult. The antibodies from the virus and the vaccine are long gone from our bodies. Like the virus has been gone since 2 weeks after we got sick. The virus is gone. The antibodies wane through years. But there is a test that they can do, but it must be given, it's an EMG, but it must be given by a specially educated physician. And that's often why it's hard to get, because physicians don't have the additional clinical studies to see what is an old polio. Case in point, I had an EMG, and the EMG actually says on the bottom, "Results are bizarre." Okay, don't ask somebody who knows what they're doing to, results are bizarre, and that was filed. Because it takes a specialty to be able to read it. A lot of survivors are struggling with that exact question. Yes.
So we've read that the polio vaccine infrastructure has been very helpful for COVID vaccine administration. Now, you mentioned it in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Where else is it functioning like this?
Everywhere that Rotary, thank you. Everywhere that Rotary has eradicated polio, the infrastructure exists. And what is the infrastructure? I believe I've been a student of it for 6 years. I actually believe it's the greatest impact on rural health in our generation. India, Africa, what they do is they don't go into the governments and say, GPEI doesn't come into the government and say, "Okay, you got to do it this way." It happens inside of communities. That's how it's working. So they meet community leaders, religious leaders, and they go in and they educate. Women in Muslim countries are now actually helping to deliver the vaccines. But the infrastructure is actually this, it's so big you can't even imagine it. It's community with community with community working together to make this happen. I was at a conference, and you know how these things go. "Hi, I'm Carol, I'm polio. Hi, I'm Jean, I'm Hep B." And she said, "Are you with Rotary?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "That infrastructure is the reason we're getting the hepatitis B vaccine delivered in Africa." The Ebola virus in Africa was contained through the infrastructure that was created through the GPEI. Nigeria was, the mothers in Nigeria, this is an interesting story we just read not too long ago. Initially when COVID began, they couldn't get childhood vaccines. Within 2 months, the childhood vaccines were back being delivered because of the infrastructure that had been created. The pause only happened for a very brief period of time. Kenya is one of the leading countries in Africa for COVID vaccines. Why? Because of the infrastructure that was created to eradicate polio. When we donate to Polio Plus, only 24% of our money goes to vaccines. We all think we're buying vaccines. No, we're not. UNICEF and World Health are doing that. Our funds are all going to this magnificent infrastructure. Jeeps, refrigerated things for people to carry on their backs to keep the vaccine cold. That's what we're paying for. We're paying for something that is positively magnificent and is long lasting. When polio was eradicated in India, that infrastructure still exists. Let's talk about surveillance. The surveillance, they found 20-year-old polio virus in the water in India. Why? Because of the surveillance that's part of the infrastructure. They're constantly testing water. So when they found it in the water, they upped the vaccination drives and make sure more children were vaccinated. I can assure you they're not just testing for polio virus. We can't imagine what's in sewage in impoverished countries.
What do you say to someone who is trusting the polio vaccine but does not trust the COVID vaccine?
I'm not qualified. I can talk to you all day about the polio vaccine. I'm not qualified technically to talk about the COVID vaccine, but from my perspective and the perspective of the majority of survivors, it's a gift from God and truly a gift of modern medicine, because we know that an asymptomatic case, me, can result in lifelong long-term effects of a virus. So, you know, the day after I got my shot, sure my arm hurt, sure I was tired, I had a headache. That's nothing compared to what can happen. This vaccine has been, you're going to hear from Dr. Offit in a couple of weeks. We're blessed to be working with that organization, the Vaccine Education Center at CHOP. You're going to hear from him about the science that has gone into this vaccine, and it's truly a miracle of modern medicine.
Carol, is there a department at HUP or at one of the other local academic medicine centers that are focusing on polio survivors?
Unfortunately not. There are physicians scattered, that's part of the problem. We've had a whole lot of conversations about this, and the majority of our work is getting survivors to physicians. I had to drive 3 hours, 2.5 hours to a clinic before I could get the help that I needed. That's not unusual. Unfortunately not. There was one at HUP, but that's no longer active.
So I gave Carol this I have a dream speech. I say it would be wonderful if the Rotarian or any other service based organization endow a chair or department at CHOP or at University of Pennsylvania. I know it's very expensive, but I'll throw it out there.
Yes.
What effect has the war on the fact that the United States withdrew from Afghanistan? Has that had an effect on the distribution of the polio vaccine?
So far, I went to a Zoom, whatever, a Rotary online conference the night before World Polio Day. And the Gates Foundation, World Health Organization, have been in Afghanistan working directly with the Taliban to keep, and the immunization drives have started again. We can just pray that stays. I will tell you, Rotary Foundation is pretty determined to support that effort. Yes.
As you experience long-term effects, what therapies are available to you? You talked about braces and wheelchairs, but are there any other approaches?
Statistically, we do very well with assistive devices and reduced activity. And when we say reduced activity, we're the only disease that's known, the late effects of polio is the only thing that's known that we need to reduce physical activity, not increase it. So the more active we are, the weaker we get. So when the clinic got a hold of me, they gave me the good care. I was doing 10,000 steps a day, right? I was also in agonizing pain all the time. I was falling constantly. I'm down to 2,000 steps a day. Physical therapy for us can't take us, they can't build our muscles can't be built up anymore. They're done, they're toast. So we have physical therapy for us means maintaining what we have. But a physical therapist that's not familiar with the late effects of polio, that can push us too far, can result, may sit here going like this, that can result in pretty significant pain. I see a physical therapist every week for myofascial release because I've got so much upper body weakness now. And my shoulders are taped into position because you can't brace my shoulders, right? You can't do that. So I'm literally taped to keep me upright. It's crazy. These are the therapy, and I have no idea why, but my pain is significantly reduced. I don't understand why. But assistive devices and reduced activity.
So Carol, could I add to that? The bottom line is for polio, it kills the neurons of our muscles. So there are muscles that never develop, right? For example, I have no hamstring and I have no quad. So what happened is when I turned 40, basically my good muscle said, I'm done. I am not going to carry you for the rest of my life. And so for us, that's exactly what Carol said. We can only try to keep what we have. It's never going to get better. It's your goal is to keep there as long as you can, but we continue to deteriorate.
It is progressive, but I talked about the physical and psychological effects of post-polio syndrome. Having to reduce our activities. I didn't go into that thing without kicking and screaming, let me tell you. That's the psychological piece of this. And that's why our hearts break for children that don't. We have a survivor in our network who was born in Ethiopia and lived in California. And she moved back to her home country this past year, and she emailed me and she said, my heart is breaking. The country of my birth, the kids who had polio are still crawling on the ground. That's the reality that we don't see in the U.S. There was a gentleman, yeah.
I just want to say thank you for the presentation. It's well rising, and I'm part of the polio eradicating polio in Nepal in 2017. I actually flew from China. Rotary, I'm a member of Rotary from China. So I actually flew from China to Nepal to walk down there. And there are some cases I actually bring on the table to the Shanghai people from Nigeria as well. So it's really, really heartbreaking. And I just want to say thank you, and we keep moving.
Thank you. Did you give the vaccine?
Oh yes, I have.
Oh, you guys all have to, afterwards, you guys all have to talk to him. He actually got to make a difference. Yes.
Just a little historic perspective. The Ardmore Rotary Club in 2005 had the distinct privilege and honor to honor Dr. Hillary Kaprowski, who lived in Wynwood, Pennsylvania, who developed the first oral polio vaccine before Salk and Sabin. But the vaccine was not stable and had no long shelf life. But the club had the privilege to honor him and to see the pictures of him doing the testing in the Congo of thousands of children that prevented polio. And he was in our midst and we didn't know it.
Right in Wynwood. Anybody else?
Thank you for the presentation here today. We wish the Polio Plus people best efforts. We hope to eradicate polio this year. We will see what these efforts occur, but it's certainly worth supporting. Thank you for coming out today. Thank you to our guests, to our visitors. You're always welcome, and that concludes our meeting today. Thank you.
Thank you.